Good morning, Kasey.
Good morning.
Thank you so much for joining us and giving up your time. I just wanted to, so just for the purpose of the judges, it's item 121 of the hearing bundle and page 1955 for the witness statement, supported by then the report summaries and the other documents, but the witness statement that's where you'll find it. Thank you. Kasey, could you just state again for the record your role and title in terms of your professional status and in what capacity you're giving evidence?
Of course, my name is Dr. Kasey McCall-Smith. I'm a senior lecturer in public international law at the University of Edinburgh Law School. I lead the LLM in human rights and am the chair of the Association of Human Rights Institutes.
Thank you very much.
I am going to be speaking today predominantly on treaty law and incorporation.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So we've heard, as you may have heard from Margaret Owen, sort of the overview of how we got to where we are and the difficulties that have ensued from certainly since 2010. So I wanted to talk, and then you're specifically talking about incorporation and particularly some of the Scottish experience that you have expertise in, and the impact of in the devolved nations. So could we just start by talking about what incorporation of CEDAW might look like?
Of course. So there are a number of ways in which we talk about incorporation, particularly in the UK, but internationally. And obviously in Scotland, as a devolved nation, there has been a lot of discussion recently on incorporation due to the positive approach that the Scottish government has taken towards incorporation and success we've had with unanimously passing the incorporation of the UNCRC, so the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, through the Scottish Parliament earlier this year. And so incorporation can be done a number of ways, and I'll take you through the three types broadly. The first, I think, is probably the easiest, and it's what we refer to as direct incorporation. And that means that the entire treaty is transposed or translated into national law. This is what we've done with the UNCRC here in Scotland, well, subject to royal assent. It means that basically the treaty is cut and pasted into national legislation, making it justiciable in national courts. And therefore, in the context of that treaty, the legislation generally speaks to how claims can be raised, when claims can be raised, and how those treaty obligations sit in the context of other existing statutory obligations. This can be done generally, like I said, there are two different ways, transposition or translation. Transposition is the verbatim use of the treaty terminology, though government ministers also often get the language wrong around this, or it can be translated, which is one way that governments often talk about bringing international law into national legislation. And that means that they shift the language slightly in different ways to make it more localized, using more localized language, particularly legal language. The second form of incorporation is indirect incorporation. Indirect incorporation can take many, many different ways. This is often done by virtue of a constitutional convention in terms that a constitution, say for example, South Africa has a provision in their constitution that means, that indicates that all ratified human rights treaties are justiciable through their legal system. However, in practice, this has variable impact because it doesn't necessarily mean that every right will be justiciable. It depends on the nature of the right. It depends on whether it has direct effect in the legislation. And really it boils down to whether the judiciary views it as a right that can be adjudicated. So indirect isn't quite as clear cut as direct incorporation. It also can be achieved through other means, such as the due regard duty, which we have with the Welsh approach to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, in that ministers are required to give due regard to the treaty obligations in the context of decision making. This gives a somewhat heightened attention to the treaty obligations, but it doesn't necessarily make the rights any more accessible or justiciable for rights holders. But there are a number of ways that this can be done, and there's ample evidence of the different ways in which states have used indirect incorporation to give some heightened acknowledgement of treaty obligations. And then finally is kind of the least obvious or the least strong, I guess, the weakest form of incorporation, which would be sectoral or piecemeal incorporation, which is generally what the UK has done in the context of most of its human rights treaties, save that of the Human Rights Act incorporation of the ECHR. And so sectoral tends to be different types of law. So say the right to education is incorporated through various different pieces of legislation, depending on which devolved nation it is. And they might speak to gender neutrality. It might speak to the special protections afforded to children and adults with disabilities, to individuals in different ways when they are members of particularly protected groups. So those are the three primary ways that incorporation can be achieved.
I'm not going to thank you. I'm not going to second guess which one you prefer, but would you just indicate and why? You said in your statement to paragraph 7 that you believe incorporation is necessary and possible. Could you just elaborate on which and what method and why you would prefer?
Yes, so I think that direct incorporation has a multitude of benefits, and the reason is that these conventions were drafted in a framework, under framework conditions. So the whole convention is designed to work together. That's how the human rights treaties were drafted, particularly when you look at the CEDAW, the UNCRC. If you look at those types of treaties, they not only reinforce the civil and political rights that exist through the twin covenants, so the ICCPR and the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. They address civil and political rights and economic, social, and cultural rights, because what the CEDAW does, even if it is dated as the previous witness explained, is that it sets up a framework with a baseline of rights and demonstrates how collectively all of the rights have to be recognized and enforced in order for one right to actually, for an individual to actually achieve full recognition of their individual rights. And so having a framework convention means that necessarily all elements need to work together. So for example, if you don't have a fully protected, promoted, and fulfilled right to education, there's very little chance that you can fully engage your civil and political rights. So the right to vote, the right to recognition and engagement and participation in government, because if you don't have a fully fulfilled right to education, you won't necessarily be able to engage your other rights. And so when we look at full incorporation, it not only brings in the rights that are outlined within the treaty. I think what's crucial and what we spent a lot of time talking about here in Scotland in the context of both the UNCRC through that process, but also through the work we've been doing on the incorporation of further human rights treaties, is that part and parcel of that incorporation needs to be recognition of the interpretive materials that are generated by the treaty bodies, in that helps the treaties evolve with developments in society, and it helps fill in gaps that we recognize now exist in a way that 40 years ago we didn't recognize. So such as technology advancements, you know, the right to privacy. No one had a mobile phone, no one had access to the internet, and it's through these interpretive measures that the treaty bodies deliver that there is an opportunity for us to understand the treaty in the context of contemporary life.
Thank you. I think that's something that Margaret touched on, which was whether the convention was fit for purpose. And I think really what we're saying, I think you're saying, is that the convention plus the general recommendations of 38 that we have so far and the committee jurisprudence, is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we need the jurisprudence of the treaty body in order to see how these norms have evolved in the same way that the common law has evolved in the UK legal system. You know, the way that common law is interpreted now and those rights that have been recognized going back to the beginnings of British law, those can't be interpreted in a static place in time. Because society, technology, science, everything evolves. And so without these interpretations, and I would even venture to say those interpretations not just through CEDAW, but if you look at European Court of Human Rights jurisprudence, if you look at discussions about the Istanbul Convention, because it obviously fills some gaps related to gender-based violence, and you know, CEDAW was drafted at a particular time and place, and that time and place was unique for those countries that were negotiating it. And since in the past 40 years, we have had a multitude of new countries that have been recognized and evolved through decolonization. And so there's a much richer discussion to be had about the way in which we recognize and respect, protect, and fulfill women's rights. That requires us looking not only at the interpretations that are delivered by CEDAW, but also through other treaty bodies. I would say, you know, the rights of women with disabilities, the commentary, the interpretations that have been developed by the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is much richer because it is able to speak specifically on those issues of disability for women, children, everyone.
So really the convention is a living instrument, but also needs to be interpreted in the light of that broader context and intersectional context.
Absolutely. Intersectionality is, I think, one of the most crucial areas where the existing law does not take heed of these particular intersectionalities that often oppress individuals in a far more insidious way than just basically looking at one individual's singular right in the context of being a woman.
I wanted to take you there next, so that's very helpful. And so in your witness statement to paragraph 10, this is just for the judge's note, you talked about the fragmented approach to women's rights and that the Equality Act hadn't achieved its aims. Can you just, this is obviously a big focus for the theme that council are presenting to the tribunal. Could you just explain a little more about what the problems of the Equality Act are? And then we'll come on to talk about the public sector equality duty specifically.
Sure, absolutely. So I think my criticism of the Equality Act, I would say, maybe I wouldn't even call it criticism, I would say observations on the realities of the Equality Act are that on its face, the Equality Act is a gender neutral law. And, you know, if you look at what the reservations, as were mentioned by the previous witness, to the UK, the first reservation to CEDAW says explicitly that it will not take, the UK does not intend to take anything that would give women increased rights over men. It takes a completely gender neutral approach, and that gender neutral approach that has been followed by the UK since it ratified CEDAW is very much reflected in the Equalities Act, which places a public sector equalities duty and variable duties on different ministers, different government agencies, and then the devolved nations in distinct ways. to ensure neutrality among the different protected characteristics. I believe there are 9. However, just providing gender neutral laws do not actually cure the long-running discrimination that women have particularly suffered. So if we take one example, or I could give an example, so I have supervised 2 projects over the last years that examine the implementation of the Equality Act in ensuring that women have equal access to their rights. And if you look at, see, one example from those studies is in employment. So if you look at the care sector, over 80% of the care sector is women are those who provide that workforce for 80% of the care sector. And in that context of the care sector, 20% of those employed in the care sector are on 0 hours contracts or temporary contracts. And they don't get to access the same benefits as those who are not in temporary contracts and not on 0 hours contracts. And the Equalities Act does nothing about those types of situations where women are historically those who populate certain areas. And all it does is ensure that women and men aren't treated unequally in that same scenario. That's fine, but the reason that women often are employed in those particular sectors is because there are there's part-time employment. It's amenable to women coming back from leave after taking maternity leave or taking time out to raise their children in ways that other types of professions might not be amenable. So women are almost directed. Also, it speaks to how we're educated. Gender neutral education does not do anything to assuage the constant social bombardment that young girls get in terms of the television, of media, of different types of basically every stimulant that's coming from society. It puts women into specific roles, and that naturally leads women to go into the care sector because it's this constant thing in the back of their heads that starts when they're very young girls. Oh, you play with dolls, you take care of this, you don't do science, you don't do math, because in gender neutral education, they just open the access to all different types of STEM training and that type of thing. They don't encourage girls to go into STEM subjects any more than they encourage boys. So if you start at the very first access and the very first engagement with society that children have through nursery, through school, they aren't encouraged, because that wouldn't be gender neutral as is set out in the Equalities Act or is set out in the reservation of the UK to CEDAW. And by limiting the engagement of children at an early age with limiting it to gender neutral as opposed to gender sensitive policies, it creates just a ready-made role for female children to fall into without any type of encouragement to do something that's different, to break that historical mold. And so this gender neutrality is carried out through, through higher education or going straight into the workforce. And so it's a cycle that cannot be broken by gender neutral laws. And that's what the Equalities Act does. It does not permit any acknowledgement of, it permits, but there's no successful, very few successful examples of considering how this not only gender neutral, but basically, protected characteristic neutral law actually acknowledges the different ways in which women and girls experience all of the different mechanisms of society that mainstream them towards being the traditional female character in life. So I think that's...
So effectively, the gender neutral laws are maintaining the status quo, therefore they're gendered, in fact.
They are gendered, in fact, yes. So, it's without, it's not on its face obviously, but the way in which it practices, and this is why the framework concept of CEDAW is so useful, in that it requires that states progressively and actively change these different roles in society. And that requires more than gender neutrality. That requires proactive measures to address these long existing inequalities.
Thank you. I mean, I think that's a theme that we're going to return to with some of the other witnesses about the impact of gender neutral policies, and we see that. Is that really why the public sector equality duty doesn't work in practice? Is that?
I don't think it's the only reason it doesn't work. I mean, I think because in the same way that the due regard duty doesn't really work in terms of giving recognition to treaty obligations, I think the public sector equalities duty, in my experience and in the research that I've done in the area, it's very poorly executed. It's often executed. I mean, I also liked what the previous witness said about a minister who is equally responsible for trade and any form of human rights, because they are often in opposition. Not always, I would definitely say, but they are often, it's an either or, and particularly for that particular minister. So I think that understanding how you can take a positive human rights approach, and that will actually have a knock-on effect for everything else, that in a positive way, such as the economy. But it's about being more creative and actually understanding what it means. So the PSED has been poorly executed because those that are responsible for determining how the public sector equalities duty is fulfilled don't understand it themselves. They don't have any familiarity with the treaty, with the various treaties that might be invoked, the UK's international obligations. To be honest, they rarely have a very good understanding of what the Human Rights Act does and what those different protections mean in a lived experience context. Because sitting and paper pushing in one office doesn't tell you what it's like to be an individual that is unable to access your rights that are very much the law, and they're yours. And so it's this lack of training, this lack of education, this lack of real understanding or even concern, because when you're sitting in an office and you don't engage with people who have little access to resources, who don't have a secure, meal coming their way, who haven't been able to engage in education, that's a different experience of life. And so sometimes without proper training, without proper understanding, you can't actually deliver any type of dedicated or considered, I guess, engagement with the public sector equalities duty. And I think that that is evident. In fact, I dare say I've never read one of their equalities impact assessments or any engagement with the PSCD where there's been a very effective engagement, particularly with CEDAW.
Yeah, no, I'm sure, I don't think I have. One of the government's responses might be that we could implement the intersectional provisions under the Equality Act, so the dual discrimination. What would you, to address that sort of, some of those structural inequalities, what would you say in response to that?
Well, enacting the intersectional dimensions, you can enact regulations, you can enact duties all day long. But if you don't get to the heart of what that gap in knowledge is, it's not going to actually render any progress for individuals. And that is the main problem, is that I can't think of the last time I heard, even in Scotland, where we have had great success in advocating for incorporation, and the Scottish government has, agreed to incorporate CEDAW and to incorporate the CRPD and ISESCR. Even though we've had lots of discussions and convinced them, that hasn't necessarily changed their understanding of what that means. And, you know, it's a great soundbite, but what we actually need are people who understand that. And that has got to start with government ministers. They are making decisions that affect the lives of millions of people. And so even if they enact the intersectional dimension, yes, that would be a welcome step. But unless they actually train those who actually engage with the PSED, actually engage with the Human Rights Act, unless they train people and demand that they continue to grow in their understanding and the application of these duties and these obligations that the state has, it's not going to make a bit of difference. And if people don't have the right to access and enforce these different rights in the context of intersectionality, then, you know, without access to justice, there is no right in reality.
Absolutely. Thank you. I just wanted to talk a bit more about the Scottish experience, because you have had a degree of success there, and there may be some learning that we might want to achieve from that. So could you just explain where the Scottish commitment to incorporation is and in what form?
Okay, so shall I talk about the UNCRC experience and the knock-on effects for the other treaties? Is that how you'd like me to structure it?
That's good. That's a good way to do it, yeah.
Okay. So in Scotland, there's always been a very strong children's rights platform, lots of civil society organizations, and they have been calling for incorporation of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, the UNCRC, for over a decade. And I think, again, it's a good point here where the government always thinks it's doing really well for children, but those who actually work with children and those who actually are involved in the lived experiences of children said, well, no, this is what you say you're providing, but this is actually what's being provided. And this is where the gap is, and this is the effect. So it's civil society organs that are often the ones that are bringing this information to light, this lived experience and what this means for law and policy. And so for 10 years, civil society had been advocating. I mean, I only came on board with this, you know, towards the last 3 or 4 years. But I think eventually, because of the first attempt of incorporation here in Scotland through the 2014 Children and Young People's Act, that gave a due regard duty to ministers, or required a due regard duty on ministers to give due regard to the UNCRC in decision making, and placed some reporting obligations on different public authorities in terms of how they were giving effect to the UNCRC. But the duty wasn't strong, and the report could say, well, we haven't changed any of our practices, but we will, you know, in future. And so I think having consistent reports where there was no change and the experiences of children weren't changed, and there were repeated examples of children being unable to access their rights, pushed for a much stronger, it led civil society to push for a much stronger obligation through incorporation and through direct incorporation. And for the last year, up until the bill was introduced, there was still a lot of going back and forth and explaining. I mean, we spent countless hours in meetings with members of the Scottish government, different members of Parliament, of the Scottish Parliament, trying to explain to them in reality what incorporation means, what it means for children. And actually, they spend a lot of time talking to children. And so getting children involved was very important. And again, with Scotland, we've had a very lucky experience that lots of the Minister for Children here was very much on board with the incorporation of the UNCRC and very engaged with children and willing to talk to children about that. And, you know, I think that the most powerful advocate for any right is the right holder, and that includes for children. And so because we went to such great detail, and I say we, this is kind of the royal we, in that the amazing civil society organs that are up here, they spent a lot of time talking the government players through this, the parliamentarians through this, and really demonstrated why it could make a difference and how important it was for them to actually follow through and quit just giving lip service to children's rights. In that process, because that was going on, we had a parallel stream because there was headway being made. And I think, you know, the perfect storm of politics, of the right time, the lots of work done by civil society organizations not related to children on advocating, particularly in the disabilities community, women's rights organizations, and just, you know, rights organizations in general, is that they were sick of stasis. And I think because the Scottish government has consistently patted themselves on their back about their commitment to human rights, I think that everyone decided to hold them to account. And so there became a very coordinated and very concerted effort. And so I started doing lots of work with civil society organizations about training them all to use the language of incorporation so that everyone used the same playbook, as it were, and so that they all could use the same terminology. That way, that when they each met separately with different members of the Scottish government, different parliamentarians, that they all use the same vocabulary and all carried the same message, that everyone has the right to have their rights and to have them in law and to be able to access them. And so through that, we've increasingly been able to gather a greater, you know, not a coalition, because we are not working as, not everybody's not working towards the same, on the same issues, but they all have the same language, the same playbook. So they understand why rights are important and they understand what incorporation means. And so that had a knock-on effect. And the Scottish government also had created, there were just so many parallel processes going on here. It's hard to keep them straight sometimes. So we had the human rights, the national, where were they? The advisory group, a group on human rights leadership going on that was chaired by Alan Miller. So we had that in 2017, I believe 2018, they issued their final report, which, you know, that was a very heavily engaged process with lots of civil society, lots of academics that do what I do. And we all had lots of discussions and very open and honest discussions, because not everybody understood or continues to understand the power of incorporation in making rights real for people. And so I think also lots of people felt burned by the lack of success they've had with the Equalities Act, which had been sold to them as a way to ensure gender equality, to ensure that disabled people were able to access their rights. So there were many of those who were jaded because they felt that they'd been sold an ineffective tool in the first instance. So what would make incorporation different? And so once the advisory group issued their recommendations, which included a discussion about incorporation over and above the UNCRC, then the Human Rights Task Force, the National Leadership for Human Rights Task Force was developed. And through that, you had lots of stakeholders, so public authority stakeholders, politicians, civil society organizations, all having these discussions and lots of engagement events with civil society, with the general public, with all different sectors. Particularly, I think it's important because we engage a lot with those public authorities who are responsible for delivering the bulk of the rights, in the way that government ministers, you know, they make decisions, but they aren't the ones that are really the boots on the ground. So they're not the ones that go out and engage with rights holders on a daily basis. They make kind of high-end decisions. So here we have these this engagement, and because the UNCRC incorporation process was so thorough and there were so many discussions, and we talked a lot about how incorporation of one treaty might impact existing legislation, might impact existing interpretations of the law as utilized by the courts. There was a lot of discussion, and because the UNCRC bill demonstrated what was a possibility. What could be done, because the UNCRC, like CEDAW, is a mixture of civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights. So the fact that we could show that actually we can make progress on all of these rights if we work together and really take the time to educate decision makers about what this means, and those who have to implement the rights about what that means and how that will change their program of work, then that actually has had a great effect. And, you know, once we went through the Human Rights Task Force year of generating its recommendations, and I was on the advisory panel, the academic advisory panel, you know, we spent a lot of time explaining little nuts and bolts of what different aspects of different treaties. So I focused on ICESCR, so economic, social, and cultural rights, how they are threaded through CEDAW, how they are threaded through the CRPD, and what that means to actually give effect to it for individuals with different intersecting characteristics, and those who had suffered discrimination in ways that your standard white, middle-aged male doesn't understand, really. So, sorry, that was quite long-winded, but
it was a really important answer, because it shows that the success of evidence-based engagement is a model that we can, which is what this tribunal partly is trying to identify and achieve, really brought about change in Scotland in a way that we could see in the rest of the UK.